Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for Ask the Expert, North Texas. I'm Kristen
I'm
Diaz.
David Rankin. We've been following very closely the demonstrations in Los Angeles over ICE raids and the possibility of more protests on Saturday throughout the country with the No Kings rallies. Police are normally supposed to handle these kinds of protests, but the federal government and governors in some states have called out the National Guard to help protect federal assets. Now the Marines are on the ground in Los Angeles. On today's Ask the Expert, we're joined by Dr. Alex Del Carmen from Tarleton State. He is in the KRLD Zoom room. Dr. Del Carmen, thank you as always.
Thanks for having me.
When did the lines blur as far as local police and what they're able to do with these mass demonstrations and the need to pull in the federal government?
You know, there's been times in the history of our country where the feds have actually been involved, as you know. Most of the time when they are involved, they provide support services, right? So the idea is to be able to relieve some of the extra things that law enforcement does in order for law enforcement to engage in the enforcement of the law. In this case would be making sure that the protesters don't get out of hand, make sure that there are no threats against the protesters, and so really keeping the peace, so to speak. So I think that as long as they have a supportive role, that's simply been historically, stated in the past. However, the problem or the challenges are if or when they get inspired to do something more than just, providing logistical support.
Now, what would be the difference essentially between what we're seeing in California, which a lot of people have formed a lot of opinions about these protests on recently because of what we're seeing in the news, and versus what could potentially happen here in Texas, where the governor actually himself deployed the state National Guard, and it wasn't brought on by the president? Could there
Yeah.
be a difference in the attitude towards them?
Well, sure, because I mean, in part, the governor, really in totality, the governor of Texas has every right to activate the National Guard. That is within his constitutional premise, right? Whether we like it or not is inconsequential. I mean, he is within his right to do that. The in the case of California, the governor did not request, nor did he activate the National Guard, which means that the president of the United States simply send out full-time employees of the federal government, in this case U.S. Marines, to be on the ground and to provide whatever kind of support they needed to provide to law enforcement in order to do that. So some people see that as an imposition of the federal government on state rights, which, as you know, was one of the premises of our U.S. Constitution.
Yeah, in 1878, Congress passed the Posse Comitatus Act that specifically says the National Guard and federal military cannot enforce civilian law in the United States. How close does what's going on come up against that?
David, that's a great question, but it really depends on what they actually end up doing, right? The presence of the U.S. Marines in California may be daunting to some people, but at the same time, they haven't really done anything except train and show that they're there, right? What happens in the next 48 hours is what is going to be interesting from a legal side, which is if in fact the U.S. Marines that are on the ground are being asked to enforce laws, that's going to take this whole argument to a very different level. And I promise you, there's going to be a lot of lawsuits being filed on Monday related to that, right? Because as you stipulated, we are a nation of laws, as George Washington once called it. And within those laws, there are parameters about what the feds can and cannot do and what certain entities within the federal government have allowed to be done. And one of them is a big no-no, in terms of practice, legal components, et cetera, is for U.S. military personnel to be on the ground on U.S. soil and proceed to arrest and various other things that is enforce, laws in this country. That is not what the military was ever designed to do, and it's certainly not what the U.S. Congress has allowed them to do.
Dr. Del Carmen, as a criminologist, I'm curious about what you can share with our listeners about instigators, people who find these opportunities to be able to lash out in a way and that they can hide behind the actual cause. And sometimes that's where, people get the wrong conclusion that these protests are not peaceful because of one or two bad apples.
Oftentimes, Kristen, when people get together in a large volume and they have very passionate opinions about things, things tend to go wrong, right? What I mean by that is one person may push another person, or one person may have not slept the night before and have a very sensitive, component that if they are looked upon the wrong way, they're going to engage in a fight. What you have to think about this is from the standpoint that, in my argument, most people that are protesting are there to do so peacefully. However, just because your intention is to have a peaceful protest, it doesn't mean that the outcome of that protest will be peaceful. And what I mean by that is if somebody provokes somebody, or if there is an outside person that comes in and tries to infiltrate the group and is of a different opinion as to the group. We've seen this time after time play out. And then law enforcement is in a very difficult spot because what they have to do then is they have to address the issue of violence, in this case, the instigators, as you would call them. And then they also have to make sure that everybody else is protected on both sides. And they're not to take side on the equation, right? They're not to go with one side because they believe that they're right versus wrong. They are to protect all lives. And so it becomes a very difficult task for them because essentially they have to make decisions on the ground. The commanders have to be on the ground. Police officers are going to be tired. They're going to be exhausted. Some of them are going to be, the subject of a lot of harassment, a lot of insults by the crowd. And people are going to be watching. And more importantly, they're going to be filming everything that happens. And sometimes these things are taken out of context.
What are the biggest mistakes that people are making in dealing with these protests in Los Angeles and around the country? And then what we could be seeing on Saturday with the No Kings?
I've seen, like, for instance, in LA, where some of the officers came in and they try to wrestle with somebody, right? And typically the protocol requires for other officers to come in and support that arresting officer, form a circle around that person so that, no outside threats would come in. There's a video that is being shown around that you can see the officer struggle with this individual, and then another officer comes in to this person's aid. But then that could have easily turned into a very difficult situation for the arresting officers in the fact that they were surrounded by like 20 people and there were no other officers in sight. And I think that a lot of times, they forget the idea that they have to work in teams and that they have been trained to do this.
Dr. Del Carmen, do you have any recollection of the mega march that happened in Dallas back in 2006? There was over 500,000 people that marched in the streets of Dallas. Again, they were participating in what was one of the largest civil rights protests in our history against immigration raids and ICE. Can you share a little bit about what history maybe has shown us, how protests have evolved from then, and what we could learn from one of the most peaceful, largest protests that we've seen in history?
In that particular instance, the lessons learned were that rubber bullets, that were used against some of the protesters ended up hurting many of the protesters. And so there were lawsuits that were filed as a result of that. Somebody, I believe, lost his eye as a result of that. And it could have been a lot worse than that, right? And so I think what law enforcement has to keep in mind, whether it's Dallas, Fort Worth, Austin, Houston, whatever law enforcement entity we're talking about in the state of Texas and even outside of Texas, is that whenever law enforcement feels the need to intervene and use force, the force has to be controlled and measured to the actual threat that is in place. And what I mean by that is you can't just randomly start shooting people or at people, with rubber bullets thinking, well, they're not really going to kill somebody because you have no idea where they're going to land. You have no idea who's going to be in the crowd. You may have elderly people in the crowd that may have respiratory issues or they may be frail in one way or another. And so you can't just make assumptions and you have to go back to training, right? So we try to train police officers specifically to deal with these types of activities on an ongoing basis so they can be current in their training, but they can also be cohesive in how they work together. Because when you start having these sort of solo actors among the officers, that's when things go south very quickly.
And as you said, there are cameras everywhere, and everyone is walking around with their phones, just shooting video of everything. And of course, that's where we see stories, as we're talking about rubber bullets being fired, where a reporter from Australia gets hit in the leg by rubber bullets flying, and pepper spray gets into other reporters. So this stuff is continuing to happen, but we're seeing more of it happen.
Absolutely. And we're seeing more of it because we have more cameras on the ground, right? It doesn't mean that in the past, in the 1960s, civil rights movement, we didn't have these events. It's just that now our technology is better. And also police officers have more powerful tools than they ever had before, right? And so it sort of like adds up to this point in history when you see that officers are using technology to their advantage, i.e. tasers and, various other neutralization techniques that they use. And on behalf of the public, they are recording everything, right? We're a one-party consent state in Texas, which means that if you yourself consent to recording, you can, right? And for the most part. And so here, what we're seeing is, and you got to remember too, guys, that there are people out there that really want to have the next TikTok video that everybody's talking about. And so there are people that are hoping that they catch something that is going to make the news so that they themselves can have a moment in history where they were able to convey that. And I would argue that those are the individuals that I worry about because oftentimes they're the ones that provoke for some of these events to go south very quickly.
We talk about the safety of protesters, and potential clashes with law enforcement, but can we also flip the script? I mean, in 2016, we had the shooting of the police officers in downtown Dallas during a Black Lives Matter protest. And that was a case where it wasn't the protesters at risk, it was law enforcement at risk. I mean, this is difficult for them as well. What kind of training is involved or preparation is involved when you've got so many different pots on the, as they say, and on the stove.
Yeah, I think that that's a great point, Kristen. And oftentimes I've been the one kind of raising the issue before the audience and the media because we oftentimes don't think about the fact that, law enforcement officers want to go home after this. They want to be able to go back to their families, right? And they didn't ask for it. They simply are showing up to make sure that people go home safely. And oftentimes we know that many of them get scraped, they get hit, they get, beaten up in some cases, and mentally, psychologically. I remember I was involved in the because I served at the time as a federal monitor for Puerto Rico, many years ago, where the governor's, was being ousted from office, and there were protesters outside of Fortaleza, which is where the equivalent of the White House or the governor's house is. There were 40,000 people outside of this particular place, and my job was to make sure that the police officers were doing things right, and if not, then I would report that to the judge. And I can tell you, I have vivid memories of those nights when people were throwing bottles, of water, acid at the officers. Many officers were hurt. Luckily and blissfully, no one was killed as a result of that, which to this day we claim that to be a successful containment of violence. But the reality is this stays in your head for a long time. These officers are going to be, permanently carrying that to work tomorrow and the day after.
Dr. Alex Del Carmen, thank you so much for the time.
Thanks for having me.